We'd like to welcome and thank everyone for joining Arm & Hammer's Animal and Food Productions webinar. The title of this webinar is Prevalence and Enumeration. What's the difference and why is it important? We're looking forward to using today's discussion to explore the differences between these two concepts and how to best implement them in your facility. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. We are recording today's webinar, and the link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants and attendees afterwards and available on our YouTube channel. Please submit questions throughout the presentation. Submissions are anonymous, and we'll address as many of the questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Steve Larsen, and I am one of the technical service managers on our great technical services team. My focus is primarily on pork, but we cover many different proteins in our group. Prior to coming to Arm & Hammer, I spent 13 years at the National Pork Board and as Director of Pork Safety and Quality, and then eventually to the Assistant Vice President of Science Technology. I've now been at Arm & Hammer for a couple years. And with that, let's get started on today's webinar. Here's a little bit of an agenda that I like to put at the beginning of each of my presentations. We'll go over a couple definitions of enumeration and prevalence, talk about some differences and maybe go over a couple scenarios, some methodologies, and when we go over these methodologies, we're not here to talk about what's better or what's worse, but we'll talk about the differences and some things to keep in mind as you try to decide what methodology is best for you in your facility. Conclusions, and then go over an example to put this all together to bring it all home, this message of this webinar. Prevalence versus enumeration. So if you look up prevalence in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, there's a couple different definitions. One of them is the quality or state of being prevalent, and the second one is the degree to which something is prevalent. And if you're like me, I like to put it in my terms, so I put down there that what that tells me is the prevalence of lymph nodes that have salmonella at or during a particular time period. That time period could be once a day, once a week, once a quarter, every quarter, or monthly or weekly. So depending on what your study is, the prevalence could be a percentage of just yes or no. Is it there or is it not there? And in this case, we're talking about salmonella. If you look up enumeration in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition is the act or process of counting something or a count made of something. All right, what does that really mean? Well, what I'd say is the amount of salmonella in a lymph node is 1 log. And this could be at a per gram basis, per mil basis, per sample, or even per area, depending on if you're swabbing a carcass or swabbing an area, maybe it's a belt or some type of environmental sample. You know, if it's there, how much is there? So what is the load? So when we refer to load, it's enumeration, percentages, it'll be prevalence. If we really want to talk about the differences between the two, here's just some bullet points of something to think about, right? If you're thinking about prevalence, it's more of an systems types approach, or even under process control. You know, if we think about it, you know, for those two examples, maybe I want to evaluate my interventions. All right, we start out with this prevalence, maybe, I don't know, 30%, and then we end up at the end of the system with this prevalence of 3%. So our intervention's working, seems like it, yes. Process control, I start out here, but maybe I end up here, so I want to evaluate other interventions. You know, like I said, 30% versus 3%, if I start at 30 and end at 3%. In the previous webinars, we had Dr. Mindy Bashirs and Dr. Christine Alvarado talk about performance standards and as they relate to public health. And if you're curious about those, please go on our website to review those previous webinars. But here, Prevalence, we could talk about how that impacts performance standards. Performance standards are based on prevalence. You know, if you need to be below 12.5% or below 3% or below 3 positives over a rolling period. And as Dr. Minya-Brashear stated out, performance standards have an impact on public health. So the performance standards were developed and set so that the public health, healthy people goals or objectives can be met. The next healthy people goal is 2020 or 2030, excuse me. So prevalence could impact public health in several ways by performance standards that impact healthy people 2030 standards objectives. And I just put down an example, 5% versus 65%. Is that good? Is that bad? It seems like a higher prevalence versus the other. When it comes down to enumeration, again, that does have an impact on public health, but more of a risk type based approach. Maybe something like a quantitative microbiological risk assessment. What is the load? How much is there? Are my interventions able to overcome that load? And we'll talk about that later as we get into this presentation. There you can come up with a targeted versus shotgun approach. Enumerations could be a lot more targeted. For example, if we're doing some type of enumeration on, let's just say lymph nodes, right? And do I need to have a more targeted approach on my pre-harvest intervention so that the load coming in doesn't overwhelm my system? So it's adequate to understand what's coming in and how my system is set up and my interventions are set up to handle that any incoming load like that. And why is that important? It just helps focus your areas on either, do I want to look at the big system type approach, the process control, or do I want to look at a targeted approach to say, hey, are my interventions working at this area or at this area, or do I need to put one here or there as you move forward? This is a slide that Dr. Minya-Brashear shared. I thought this was very relevant to this type of topic. On the left-hand side, we have the probability of illness. Below is the log dose. And Dr. Brashear's got this from the WHO. But really what this says is when you get to that 4 log dose, if we're talking about enumeration, your probability of illness really increases. So that 4 log is that red line right there. And that's where we're going to focus on of, hey, where's our main point of concern would be 4 logs. If we get above that, we're really concerned. If we get below that, we're a little bit less concerned, but we'll keep an eye on it. Here's a couple scenarios to think about when we're talking with prevalence and enumeration. Scenario 1, let's say we're going out and testing product and 8 out of 24 samples are Salmonella positive. That's a 33% prevalence. But if we dive into it with enumeration, 7 of those positives are just at 1 log, 10 CFUs per gram. But 1 of those positives are at that 4 log level. Are we really concerned? Are we less concerned? What does that mean? Do we need to put in interventions? Or does this say, hey, our interventions are working because chances are we have interventions that are reducing it by 3 logs down to that 1 log. So is everything kosher and we're doing okay? Scenario number 2 is, hey, we're testing some more product the next month and 6 out of 30 samples are Salmonella positive. That's a 20% prevalence, so that's lower than the scenario 1. However, only 1 positive is at 10 CFU per gram or 1 log, but we have 5 positives that are at that 4 log or above threshold. So does this mean that maybe our interventions aren't working quite as well? Do we have a greater impact on public health because we have a higher log count, even though it's a lower prevalence out there? Whereas scenario 1 may be more adequate for our performance standard. If our performance standards are at a 30% threshold or 7 positives and we're above that, then we need to get below the threshold for our performance standard. But scenario 2 says we're below the performance standard, but we've got a high load count. So do we need to evaluate our systems types approach or come to a more targeted type approach and say, hey, we got to get below this 4 log load that's coming through our system? And if we're looking about prevalence versus enumeration when it comes down to methodology, you know, there are a lot of methods out there. And they all have great methodologies. There are many labs out there and they all have great methodologies. some things to think about is, are they AOAC approved? Is this a USDA FSIS approved method, or is it just an internal lab method? What method are we going with? And whatever method you decide to go with, is it a PCR-based method or an ELISA-based method, or is it a culture-based method where we need a culture out of it to come up with a serovar? There's a lot of differences out there that could impact the accuracy of those methodologies. When we talk about accuracy, the sensitivity and the specificity of any given test, and the sensitivity is, what is a true positive? A positive is a true positive, or another word to think about it is false negatives, right? Those impact your sensitivity analysis if it's a 95% sensitive test versus 99 sensitive test. The opposite is specificity. Specificity relates to the true negatives or the false positives. And again, that impacts your number if it's a 99% specificity test, but that can go to your true negative or false positive test. And each of those have pros and cons that we have to wait when we're coming up. We're trying to determine what methodology we'd like to use when we come up with a system, when it's either prevalence or enumeration. Another thing to think about is the limit of detection or the limit of quantification. Let's say that you have a limit of detection of around 1 log, but you say, hey, we did a study, we averaged 3 logs out there, and we had an intervention where now we cannot find anything, so our intervention has a 3 log reduction. When in actuality, your limit of detection is 1 log. So was it really a 3 log reduction, or did it just take it below your limit of detection? So you have more samples out there that are below your limit of detection that gives you some false negatives out there. And then the methodology will also help you understand the number of samples needed. Typically, when you're talking about prevalence versus enumeration, prevalence, typically you have more samples that you'll need to determine a statistical difference than you will enumeration. So those are some things to think about. And at the last is cost. Each test has a cost, each lab has a cost for doing those tests, and the samples needed to understand or determine the level of significance out there. So cost is an important part of when you're coming up and trying to determine what sample, what methodology I should use when either I'm doing a prevalence study or an enumeration study or a prevalence and enumeration study. Those are not necessarily inclusive of each other. They could be jointly together. So if we talk about prevalence versus enumeration, and the conclusion is both of them give valuable information. Some things to understand is, what can my interventions handle? Is it a systems types approach? Excuse me. Understanding my incoming load, that goes more toward enumeration. And also, one thing to keep in mind is prevalence is not correlated to load, right? So just because you have a high prevalence doesn't mean you have a high load, or vice versa. If you have a low prevalence, you don't have a low load. So prevalence is not necessarily correlated to load. Try to always start with the end in mind. What's your objective? Are you trying to understand, hey, what's the percentage positives I have when it comes to, our performance standards? Or do I really want to know what's the load in my facility so that I could target an intervention at a specific point in my facility? Go out there and do a thorough literature review. That'll help you understand where you're at, or where you need to start designing, and where the previous prevalences or loads are at, and then bring in a statistician for input. And that should probably be up to a higher time point in that. Is one thing that I've learned is get the statistician involved early, because they can really help you out when it comes to methodologies, making sure that you have a fresh set of eyes, your objective is clean. They'll help you understand, hey, what samples are needed to get my statistical p-value out there, if it's p less than 0.05. And we've got one of the best statisticians out there, so they really help keep me in tune and in line when they come up with study development, looking at prevalence versus enumeration. And lastly is continually review and improve, right? Not necessarily during a study, but at the end of each study, hey, let's do some triage and figure out, hey, what did the study show us? What did it tell us? What are the hiccups? What can be done better? How do we improve this for the next round? So that we have our samplings down pat and we can understand where we need to focus our attention. And if we look at an example, right, so I tried to pull an example that this group might be interested in. Let's say we want to be proactive and prepare for the proposed Salmonella standards in the pork industry for parts and ground and comminuted, right? So you go to our PPP statement, our purpose, process, and payoff statement. So what's the purpose of this study? All right, well, we want to reduce the salmonella in ground pork. We did some initial studies looking at salmonella in ground pork. We think we might be high. We don't know where the standard's coming out, but we want to be proactive to address salmonella in ground pork. Well, that's a pretty vague purpose, and we would ask some why questions or what questions to really get down to, hey, what do you really want to do? What's the purpose of this study? And eventually we'll come up with an objective that says, hey, we want to determine the potential for lymph nodes that contribute to salmonella in ground pork and the magnitude of salmonella load attributable to those lymph nodes, right? So what that objective tells us is we're going to do a study that encompasses both prevalence and enumeration. The prevalence of salmonella in lymph nodes, and then the load or enumeration of salmonella within those lymph nodes. Give you two different stories there. So what's the process of conducting this study? All right, as I said, let's go out there and do a thorough literature review. You know, what lymph nodes end up in ground pork that we need to be keeping an eye on. Of those lymph nodes, have any of them been studied? And if so, what's the prevalence of those lymph nodes? Is there a load associated with those lymph nodes to give us a starting point? Does the source of pigs have an impact on the prevalence and or load that contribute to ground pork salmonella? Is there a seasonality effect? So do we need to set up a study that goes across multiple seasons and see what seasonality there is when it comes up with salmonella? Get that statistician involved early, especially with that literature review, so that you can go over, hey, what's the number of samples I need to take? Do I got to be in there for 1 day, 3 days, a week, 2 weeks? Are we going to go over each quarter, first, second, third, and fourth quarter? Or are we just going to do a summer and a winter one, depending on seasonality? Do we need to sample multiple times in 1 day? You know, depending on the prevalence versus enumeration. Then we'll move to identify our methodologies, since we both want to do prevalence and enumeration. You know, so we not only want to do the percentage of positives, but we want to know the level and the magnitude that are positive. And then that'll help design our study, right? What's that study design? We're going to be in there for a week, sample at least 3 times a day. We want to get different sources of pigs. We're going to sample each lymph node. We're going to take 8 of each lymph node out. We're not going to pool them, or maybe we will pool them, depending on what the prevalence is. And then that'll get us go back to our objective is, then we'll get to be able to determine the potential for lymph nodes that contribute to salmonella in ground pork, and then the magnitude or the load of those lymph nodes of salmonella in those lymph nodes. And then what's the payoff of the study, right? So that'll help target approaches for reduction of salmonella in ground pork, right? So if you look at the prevalence, what's the prevalence going to tell us, right, in this study? What's the benefit of prevalence? Well, it'll tell us the number of lymph nodes that are positive. Is it 3% versus 12%? Is it 1% versus 20%? What's the frequency of those salmonella positive lymph nodes going into ground pork? And then what would enumeration tell you? What's the magnitude of salmonella in those lymph nodes? Is it a high load? Is it 10 to the 4? Is it 10 to the 3? Is it 10 to the 2? That's going to help impact maybe some targeted interventions out there. If you want to put them either a pre-harvest intervention to try to address the salmonella prevalence and load coming in versus the magnitude that you see in those lymph nodes, or is an intervention more applicable to when those lymph nodes are ground up and you can address or spray or treat the ground pork to reduce or eliminate the salmonella load and prevalence after those lymph nodes are ground into ground pork. You know, so to really identify a good spot or good approach or good target to apply an intervention to try to reduce and or eliminate those salmonella loads and levels when you're looking at this study. So I know this is kind of a quick, about half the time of the webinar. I've just finished up. I'd like to open it up now for questions. I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance and participation in today's webinar. We hope the insights shared today can help you better assess your risk and optimize your facility's food safety plan. As I'd like to remind you, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat box. Those submissions are anonymous, and we'll address those right now. And again, thank you for your time. And if you want to contact us or to have a discussion online, please reach out to us. And please remember that please look for an email that will be sent out in the next few days with a link to the webinar recording. So now I will open it up to any potential questions that you may have. All right, here's our first question. So do you think the Salmonella standards will look more at a plus-minus enumeration or both? That's a great question. So I'm going to go on what Dr. Minnie-Brashears talked about in the previous seminar series. It's probably going to be more along the lines of a plus-minus or a percentage, right? So it'll be either the previous pork standards were at 8.7% of carcass prevalence, and all indications USDA is going to come out with a parts and pieces level and then a comminuted / ground level. When I say level, I mean plus minus. So it doesn't appear that they're going to come out with enumeration, but I think Dr. Brashears said that that's something that the agency is looking into. So maybe in a few years that'll come out, but it appears it'll just be plus minus. Are there any more questions out there? That was a great question. Here's another question. Do you think the new standards will follow the beef standards or the poultry standards? Don't know offhand. It's going to be up to whatever USDA, the agency, came up with their exploratory sampling and looking at the prevalences they saw in the parts and pieces and then the ground and comminuted. So it's tough to take a guess right now if they will be more like the beef standards. I know that there's a proposed ground beef standard out there on a rolling 52-week sampling period, but as of right now, don't know if it'll look more like the beef or the poultry standards yet. Well, I think we've probably reached our end of questions. So again, I want to thank everybody for their time, and please look out for an email that will be sent in the next few days with a link to the webinar recording. And I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you for participating. Bye-bye.